Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Star Wars The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi might be the nerdiest Star Wars movie I've ever seen, or at least the nerdiest one since the original. And I think what I mean by that is it's made by somebody who clearly likes tabletop games and obscure Marvel Star Wars comics and samurai films and anime, and thought, hey, why don't we not just leave this Star Wars kind of idea alone? Why don't we sort of fuck with it? Rian Johnson feels like somebody who went through the original Star Wars, went through all the influences, saw Hidden Fortress, saw all the Akira Kurosawa films throughout his entire filmography, got into all sorts of stuff through Star Wars, and is now using all of those influences to make something completely new, who really got into Lucas and dove deep into Star Wars and everything that made it Star Wars, but kind of thought, what if we could do something different and make up all those influences into a new Star Wars film? It makes The Force Awakens influences look like some basic bitch, and makes The Last Jedi's influences look cool and amazing and interesting. It's like Rian Johnson decided that he could take all of his own influences and the things that influence him as a filmmaker, much like how Lucas did with the original 1977 film, and kind of did something new and infused it with the Star Wars universe, and you can tell he's very much at play within this film. I'm almost surprised at how much at play Rian Johnson got to really be with the Star Wars film. You think of these huge, big, massive kind of productions the Star Wars films are, especially now with Disney involved and all that, that they'd let him have as much free reign over this film and do as much as he does with this film. But it almost feels like the reason that they kind of fired all those other people and didn't fire Rian Johnson was because he seemed to be enough of a talented director, have a good enough of an auteur voice to actually do something with a Star Wars film. It was surprising. In fact, I'm kind of surprised how different this movie was, and it kind of goes into the whole idea of seeing a Star Wars movie move and flow like a Star Wars movie should. When I keep hearing about the negative or divisive reaction to this film, I'm kind of more surprised at how it seems to be the problem is it's not a traditional Star Wars film. And I'm like, well, yeah, no shit, sorry. It was never trying to be a traditional Star Wars film. That was the whole point of it. It's counterbalancing to The Force Awakens, where it almost feels like two directors like playing telephone, and Rian Johnson sort of being a bit of a jokey dick with all the things that J.J. Abrams introduced, from the whole disregard to certain things to the jokey atmosphere. It feels like Rian Johnson was totally let play within this world and be his own director. That's kind of what's shocking about The Last Jedi. It almost feels like Rian Johnson made a film that was as successful as The Force Awakens, and this is his sophomore kind of follow-up thing where the studio lets him do whatever he wants. But like, this is his Spider-Man 2, but I don't think he made a Spider-Man 1. Am I forgetting some movie? Because it really feels like this is the self-assured guy who could tell the studio to, buzz off, I did one for you, but that never happened. Looper was cool, but it wasn't that big of a hit. So it's almost shocking he's able to take as many risks as he is in this film. Now, I don't think this film is perfect. I do think it is actually very good. I think it takes a lot of influences, particularly Kurosawa, who's always been a huge influence on the Star Wars movies, but never quite utilized as well as it was in this film, or I guess in the original. But in terms of at least color cinematography, Kurosawa, I've never seen a Star Wars film do with anything with that. Most of the influences on Star Wars films previously felt like the black and white Kurosawa, which was more of the Kurosawa that influences Lucas when he was growing up. And since clearly Rian Johnson saw things like Ran, which, Lucas helped pay for, and a lot of the Kurosawa films that Lucas helped get wider releases or talk to distributors to make sure Kurosawa wasn't forgotten or something, seems to have actually ended up influencing a Star Wars film, which is sort of interesting. It has such a beautiful visual sense to it. It does feel like a foreign film or more of a Japanese influence. I'm actually curious how this film is going to do in Japan and what their reaction will be. Clearly they probably know about the samurai influence, but particularly the shot of Leia, it's in the trailer, so I'm not going to spoil things till there's a spoiler section. When Leia's holding her coat over her face, and it felt more Asian in that sense, particularly like any lightsaber battle felt more like a kung fu movie or a samurai film, more so than traditionally we see with American films right now. Most directors, I think, would tell you that the Criterion Collection is something cool you should check out, or you should watch Turner Classic Movies, and Rian Johnson feels like in his filmmaking bones that he is that guy who actually does those things. And it's kind of cool to see him play with that, particularly how he uses characters, and he uses the character arcs in ways that don't feel like naturally within what is a 3-act structure. But obviously 3-act structure isn't really a thing. It's just kind of a shorthand for explaining plot. But regardless, that's not important for this review, but this film definitely isn't even trying to do any sort of a thing that resembles what that is. I would say presumably almost has 4 or 5 acts, even if that, like, it really tries to do its own structure. And it almost, I was surprised, like there was a certain point I was like, wait, this movie is still going. And it is a long Star Wars movie, and Star Wars movies are never short. They're traditionally around 120. This is not. It's like 150. It's 2.5 hours, and it feels like an epic, extended, huge movie. It feels like almost like a director's cut in the craziest sense of the word. And a lot of people have said it feels like a season finale or something, and I don't think that necessarily. It kind of takes everything that this trilogy is supposed to represent. It makes everything that is the most important sort of what's left. It gets rid of all the window dressing that maybe sort of didn't represent much of anything, and kind of plays with the ideas that J.J. Abrams, in maybe his weaker mystery box storytelling, didn't really know exactly what he was going to do with. And The Last Jedi goes, well, I'm gonna have fun with that. I'm not just gonna, like, you know, mess that up, which you can often do with Abrams. But it's interesting that both this and both what this is what Brad Bird did after he did his follow-up to a J.J. Abrams film, which was Ghost Protocol. He made probably the best Mission Impossible movie. I think Justin Lin made probably better, at least. I don't know if it's better than the first one, but it's one I really liked, the third Star Trek movie. And Rian Johnson, I think, made a really impeccable, interesting Star Wars movie. So it seems like J.J. Abrams is good at setting things up for another director to play with. I think Rian Johnson, what he did with this film is kind of inspiring, because it shows you can still have fun with the $200 million blockbuster, even though I can't seem to find out how much this movie costs, but let's just say it doesn't look cheap. That sense of play and wonder, and I mean, almost felt like he had a little too much fun, but I think that's actually pretty cool to see from a movie like this. And just the weird way it flows, the weird influences it has, how it seems to use things from Akira Kurosawa to even the film Samurai from the 50s that Toshiro Mifune was in, makes me feel alive in terms of a cinephile, in terms of a Star Wars film. And I didn't find it divisive at all. I actually quite liked it a lot, but I would recognize that it's a very different feeling Star Wars film, and that does feel very different. And I understand if people, what they liked about Force Awakens is it brought you back, and this is kind of the promise that we've all been talking about with Star Wars films, is what if we did something different with it? Rogue One was the theoretical idea of that, maybe not necessarily the greatest movie, but the theoretical idea of let's do something different with Star Wars. And we saw that and we were like, that's fine, but it was basically like went down fine. It was like a big blockbuster movie, everyone was cool with it. But Last Jedi really pushes that to such a different level that you're almost not necessarily prepared for it, which makes it that much more exciting. It's kind of cool to see an exciting Star Wars movie, and not just because it's a good Star Wars movie, more because it's actually a risky good Star Wars movie that seems to do interesting things with the characters, and he seems to actually have fun with the identity and the ideas of these characters. Now, he doesn't seem to want to introduce them very well. He kind of completely relies on the fact that you've seen The Force Awakens. Now, The Force Awakens is the highest grossing film in American history, third highest grossing film, I think, internationally or worldwide. You probably have seen it, although I went with someone who hadn't seen Force Awakens, which was surprising. But it doesn't do the sequel thing where you could watch this without seeing it, but it's sort of like those things nowadays where, like, well, so many people have that we should be fine. But I kind of sort of like that idea of, like, even in The Winter Soldier, it sort of introduces the idea of Captain America and introduces Falcon and the whole idea and the premise of it, and it plays like almost a solo individual film. Now, this plays very much like a middle part, you know, it plays very much in tandem within that, and that's sort of an interesting, odd place to be. This is a very kind of odd, funky, strange Star Wars movie, and it doesn't really give a fuck about whether you like it or not, which is sort of cool. I sort of like that, having weird, crazy creatures that did feel like more out of the Marvel Comics adaptations, the one from the 70s and 80s when they stopped doing the just straight adaptations of the movies and still put out issues, and like Han Solo had a bunny rabbit Bucky O'Hare type friend, but from someone who genuinely loved that and felt like, well, what if we wrote those better and actually brought that into the Star Wars universe? This feels like someone who read a lot of the kind of spin-off Timothy Zahn books and shit like that, and like thought like, hey, there's some cool ideas in there, what if we like really brought that into this? and did some interesting things with some of that and brought in the stranger elements that Lucas didn't really create, but all the spin-off novels and comic books really did. And I think that's honestly something that's so cool about this movie. It showed a real playfulness from this franchise right when you thought that it was probably a lot more conservative than it really was. I will say, I think if you like Star Wars, I think you will eventually grow on this movie. I think people will end up really liking this film quite a bit. And I think with time, this film definitely will age very well, particularly how so many things it does well, particularly with the score and how it uses older themes and newer themes and just has just score in certain places and doesn't have any sound in certain places and does interesting things with those visuals within those sections. I think will make people just go like, wow, that was something really special from a Star Wars film. It might be the most uniquely dark thing since Empire Strikes Back, but in a lot of ways it's sort of its own shit, so comparing it to that is just like, hey, that was a good Star Wars middle and this is a good one too. No one's bringing up Attack of the Clones with this shit. I would highly recommend this film. I think it is a more accomplished, interesting film than The Force Awakens. I don't think it is as rewatchable necessarily, but I still think it is a really cool, interesting one. Because I want to get into spoilers, I think this is a film that kind of relies on the fact that you don't know all these things, and I think it sort of would mess with your viewing if you just heard most of the bigger revelations in this from some jerk's YouTube movie review. But if you are in that situation, and I'm sorry, then maybe pause this and you can come back to it. And I'll actually put a little thing in the bottom with a timestamp of past the spoiler section. So if you do just watch to this point and want to come later, you can just go there and it'll be a little easier for you. All right, so after this point, I'm going to be talking about spoilers. For Star Wars, one of the bigger elements and themes of The Last Jedi is disappointment, which is kind of like a theme of life in general, but this film really takes advantage of and plays with in kind of interesting, fun ways. And that starts off with Luke kind of just throwing the lightsaber off that he's been handed by Rey, that we've been waiting for 2 years to see what is Luke going to do when he trains Rey or so forth, and he clearly doesn't really give a fuck, and then he just kind of throws it off into the ocean presumably, and the porgs can just play with it. One of the things about that disappointment that plays into it is the whole idea of that you find out that Luke may have tried to kill Kylo Ren, to the idea that Rey's parents are just shitty parents who sold her for drinking money presumably. That goes into the whole idea of the disappointment of life, the disappointment that this awesome, amazing generation that did destroy 2 Death Stars, that destroyed the Empire, that all this stuff kind of failed past that. You know, they had this amazing life, they did these things, but they're also majorly disappointing. And I think with the letting down of Rey's parents, that's another thing where you want that to be something, you want it to be something meaningful, and it turns out it's not. And in terms of those other 2 things, I think that disappointment works because it shows you there's multiple layers to life. And I think that's a thing that runs throughout particularly The Last Jedi. The whole idea that there are arms dealers, you find out in the kind of casino planet, whatever the fuck it is. When you hear about that there are arms dealers, that there are people who make money off of these Star Wars, you kind of get the sense that there's more of a gray to this world than we presumably thought. We always looked at Star Wars as black and white, basically. But I think it kind of shows you that with life, certain elements and certain arguments and certain battles can be very black and white, but there is more to that. That is a kind of a hard thing for people to get used to. I think it is the idea of not having an easy answer in life and not having an easy answer overall. That is something that The Last Jedi really goes towards really hard. You know, the idea that sometimes, you know, you might think something's one way and it's not, particularly with the whole idea of what happens with Laura Dern's character. You think maybe she'll turn out to be evil or a bad leader, but she's not. She just couldn't tell him then, and maybe he was being impulsive and being wrong, and how can Poe Dameron be wrong? Even the idea of Finn trying to escape in front of Rose, which was the big disappointment for her, that he's like this great leader, and kind of finding like the humanity of him through her interactions with him, and how he can even be disappointing. It's a whole thing running throughout it, and I think that's a really great thing for Star Wars. Each of these films, the saga films, plays in a different generation. It shows the disappointments of a previous generation and how you need to play off of them. And every past generation will fail the next generation in some way, whether it be, you know, that this environment is fucked, whether it's be that they voted for a certain president or something, or supported the wrong thing, or said the wrong thing in a family gathering or something, but they will fail them in some way. It's inevitable. It happens to everyone. You should just deal with it. It's just a cause of life. As much as you think, I won't be that generation, you will. We all are. Deal with it. It's fine. I think The Last Jedi Jedi kind of goes into that in ways that are interesting, because I don't think Luke is not a hero now. Clearly he had a mistake happen, and he had a mistake that he recognized in that moment, and it kind of sort of, that whole thing got super out of hand. It shows more of a humanity to Luke that we thought, after seeing him in Return of the Jedi, we thought maybe wasn't as much there as it was seeing him in his future years between this film and Return of the Jedi. But I also think it goes into the whole idea of the disappointment thing, particularly with Rey and the parents. And this film, it does fuck with you. It is trolling you. It is going like, who are the parents going to be? And there are tons of times that I was sitting on my seat and like, oh shit, is it going to be something fucked up like Luke and Leia had sex and this is their kid and they dropped him off? It's going to be something really fucked up, isn't it? And it's still fucked up, but it's not what I said fucked up. That her parents are just horrible. They're just terrible people. And they gave her up, and for drinking money or for something, because she was just too much to deal with. I think the point of that goes into the whole theme of her versus Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren is the kid who comes from a good family. He's from the Skywalker bloodline. He should be the next great Jedi. He went to the best private schools, got trained by the greatest Jedi Master of the time, Luke Skywalker, and he can just presumably just be Darth Vader by being that great of a Jedi Master. I mean, like, think about that. Anakin, at least, and he still went to the best private schools too, but he came from nothing and became this huge thing, and same with Luke. But Kylo Ren didn't. Kylo Ren, came from the system, was supported by the system, was trained by the system, rejected it for a completely different system. He is kind of the rich kid who gets to ascend because he is the 1%, and that's how things work out for him. Rey isn't. Rey is a kid from nowhere who suddenly became something, and Kylo Ren does not know how to deal with her. Having those kind of talks between the two, which is really cool, and it's also cool they didn't really use special effects. It's just cut between them where it's just like them talking. It's just simple editing and things. I'm curious how they even shot those sequences, but I think they did a great job. It works flawlessly despite the fact that they use very limited special effects in this huge special effects blockbuster, which you think they would do something different with, but they don't. Even the thing where it's like, put a shirt on, damn Kylo. I like that idea. I like the idea of her not having parents that are like anything, because that is the whole idea. That is the whole part of her character. If she was a Skywalker, that wouldn't work, because you've already done that with Luke, where he's a hidden Skywalker. We're not doing that again. You're not gonna have her be like Leia and Han's secret daughter or something, stupid like that. She's not gonna be Qui-Gon Jinn's secret granddaughter or something. I don't know. It doesn't matter what you thought she was going to be. She's not. She is literally coming from nothing, coming from nowhere, and that's how the rebellion will be. And that's another theme of this film. The rebellion comes from these mythic stories and these kids who believe in these things and become these things. That's the point of the last shot of the movie, really, is that these kids can rise up and eventually fight these oppressors and try to take down some of the evil that is in the galaxy. And Rey represents that, and Luke represented that, and Anakin just didn't really. That whole thing is nonsense. Let's not talk about that. But the whole idea of them going and coming from nowhere and becoming something almost feels like that role is predestined. It's like someone always has to fill it in a way. I feel like that kind of falls into this a little bit, but it also, I think, shows the idea that you can come from nothing and become something in this universe. I think it works better, frankly, for me, and narratively it does, that Rey is not coming from anything. We all speculated, and I think also the problem with the mystery box is it's more about creating a mystery than having a good solution, and I think it is kind of a shocking thing. I would like to still see her shitty parents sell her or something to make the most depressing Star Wars flashback sequence ever. I still think it's a good idea. Another great thing is seeing Yoda again and seeing puppet Yoda, which was so shocking to me. I was like, that's CG, obviously, but I was like, holy shit, no, that's a puppet. That's puppet Yoda. And it felt like Empire Strikes Back Yoda too, which is the best Yoda. Although they had a lot of like puppets and realistic, kind of in camera kind of effects, they still had a ton of CG in this. It was cool to see Rian Johnson play with that. I haven't seen a director really have fun with CG and special effects in this way, which I thought he did very well. The only part that I thought went too far, and they were both parts in this that I thought went too far. One, the Carrie Fisher thing. I don't know where they were going with that, with her bringing herself back in. I just didn't think that worked. It's not because she had died and I was like, oh, this is how we're just gonna kill Princess Leia. It's a little cold, guys. I don't know. I was fine with like the other crazy force powers with Luke, astral projecting himself and stuff, that I really didn't have a problem with. I think it makes sense. He's a crazy Jedi Master, of course. He's got cool, crazy Jedi powers and stuff. But Leia, who we've never seen use the Force before, I was like, I mean, I don't know about that, but fine, whatever. The one part I think that could have been completely cut out was the whole thing with them freeing those whatever creatures from the casino planet, because ultimately, what were we really doing with that? Was that going to help us in any way? Was that going to help, like, the plot? Like, you could have completely cut that out. I thought that was a bit too far. You just had to get them from point A to point B to leave with Benicio del Toro. You didn't really necessarily need them to do that. Like, I didn't really understand the purpose of that whatsoever. It didn't really feed into much of anything, honestly. But it seemed like Rian Johnson found ways to get all these characters to work, but it didn't necessarily work within that structure, and I think that was smart to move these characters more naturally. That one in the big room with Snoke, after they kill Snoke, where they fight the Imperial Guards, that is something that I've been waiting for since Return of the Jedi. You always see those Imperial Guards, and you're always like, so those guys do something cool, right? I mean, if they're gonna guard the Emperor, they have to be, like, really good. And you never saw them do anything. And I was always like, man, they gotta do something cool. But they look so cool. And in this, I love, like, they did their little stances and stuff before. I was like, oh man, they're gonna do something cool, finally. And that fight was amazing. It was like out of a Bruce Lee movie or something. And I love that they burned down that background, and he literally has the greatest view in the world. How much of a stupid villain is he that he was like, I'm just gonna block out this amazing space view for this cool red backdrop. Somebody I saw it with was like, you know, he probably looks at space all day, so it's probably super boring to have that view. I'm like, I guess, but that view is way better than the red backdrop. I love that fight sequence. I think it has a bit of surrealism that often kung fu and samurai films can have in terms of using that background, using that fighting and stuff, and I love that because it was just like so amazing, that fight sequence. It is one of the great lightsaber battles of this new trilogy and probably of Star Wars in general. I actually sort of like how he used all these different creatures in this. The whole idea of freeing those creatures sort of goes into with another theme that this film has of these creatures, all, you know, whether it be the porgs or the snow critters or something, just like naturally like respecting the wildlife or the wild animals in, you know, whatever planet they're on, and understanding, you know, that they're a part of the ecosystem and to respect them and so forth. And I did like that idea with the porgs and the snow critters, those weird horse things. I was like, guys, I don't really give a shit. Like, it's like that didn't really work as well. I think it worked better as kind of like a background thing you could appreciate. Although I didn't think the porgs needed to be on the Millennium Falcon. I thought that was pushing it a little too far, particularly at the end part. I love the kind of odd, interesting surrealism of the Red Planet and how he could use that and use kind of the background in very much a Anthony Mann way, and in the awesome like war film western way of kind of showing emotion through your backgrounds and so forth. And I think the Salt Planet worked out so well for that. A lot of people were like, oh, it's just reminding you of Hoth, and I was like, it is a little, but it definitely, in terms of like even the way that base is laid out, is very much Hoth. But in terms of the way he used that setting and he used that planet, it was far more effective. To make his own planet and have it be the planet that bleeds was kind of cool. This was Rian Johnson's big auteur epic, but it's like his big auteur epic using all the interesting odd bits of Star Wars but infusing them with his own influences. And I think that's a beautiful thing. If we're going to have all these directors take on Star Wars and remake it in their own image, this is the first movie I've seen from the Kathleen Kennedy led Lucasfilm that really does that in such a beautiful way. It felt so long and crazy and so forth. It felt almost like Harry Potter. It felt like World War II movies. It felt like samurai films. It felt like all these influences that many people, when they left Star Wars, felt like that about. The original Star Wars felt like that about. I don't think this is the best Star Wars film. I think I would probably put several others, like the first Star Wars and Empire, and maybe even Force Awakens above it. But I appreciate this film for its chutzpah, for what it's trying to do. But if you hate this film for not being a traditional Star Wars film, fuck you. This is the Star Wars film that we need at this point. We need something to reinvent the wheel, to reinvigorate it, to do something different. This is not a bad movie. It is not a perfect movie. I think it's too long. I could feel the audience kind of losing it towards the end, like getting a little impatient with it, but still liking it. As a whole, I think it's a very good movie. There are certain sections, the like the creatures going away and Leia going and things like that. I don't mind the Force stuff. I don't really mind all the nitpicky things. Star Wars The Last Jedi is the big auteur Star Wars movie that we haven't gotten since the big auteur statement that made the original Star Wars movie. And you kind of have to appreciate it for that. I think, just saying, hey, auteur theory, and that's why I liked it, is the weakest film critic reason you can give. But I think in terms of The Force Awakens, it just does it so beautifully. It just takes so many risks and pushes itself and just disregards, either Rey's parents or the whole idea of Luke training Rey or things like that, and takes a lot of different modes and makes battles not look as heroic, particularly with Poe's opening thing. And General Hugs was amazing. I love General Hugs. And Domhnall Gleeson just becoming straight out comic. Rian Johnson had a lot of fun, but also had a lot of fun in terms of being a big auteur director. And I've loved Rian Johnson as a big director for a long time. And I'm so happy with what he did with this film. I think he really did an amazing job with this. I don't even think it's one of his best movies, but I'm just happy with the risks and the awesome visuals and everything it really did with this. I love that it took on Kurosawa. I love that the Kylo Ren Luke lightsaber battle reminded me of the Samurai trilogy starring Toshiro Mifune, where they really use the sunlight to really hit them, when they're doing that battle. That felt straight out of samurai films. The whole idea of using those visuals and using these epic battles and using these backgrounds is something from westerns and samurai films, which are both things that influenced the original Star Wars. This felt like somebody who understood those influences and understood how to twist them. But sci-fi is the genre of ideas when it is done correctly, even though it has become the ideas of blockbuster. And he took ideas from war films and all these things and made a big, epic, kind of deep sci-fi Star Wars film. What this film did is it brought Star Wars back to being kind of a big cinematic nerd movie from a genre that was made by a cinematic nerd who no one was asking for him to make that kind of movie at the time, and he surprised everyone. I think no one was asking Rian Johnson to make this, and I frankly love his kind of I don't give a shit, this is the Star Wars film I'm making sort of thing. It plays into being one of the more populous Star Wars films, but also being one of the Star Wars films that doesn't really care what the populace thinks. That's kind of a really weird place for a Star Wars film to be, but I'm really happy that Star Wars was taken to that place by Rian Johnson. So if you've seen Star Wars The Last Jedi and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.